You're a waiter, Robert. My guests move in different circles. Those words didn't just sting, they cut through decades of sacrifice in a single breath. I had been standing on the stone terrace of Ethan Markham's sprawling estate, the winter air so sharp it made my lungs ache. Behind him, strings of white lights wound through perfectly manicured hedges, each bulb glowing like a little reminder of the money he had to burn. Inside, my daughter Lillian's laughter floated from the dining room, warm and musical, so far removed from the tone in his voice. I should have been prepared. Men like Ethan were easy to spot, their success displayed in the square set of their shoulders, in the way their eyes scanned you like a resume. But a part of me still believed, hoped that marrying my daughter meant he might see me through her eyes, as the man who had given her every opportunity in life. I was wrong. Long before that night, I had walked away from a rising acting career for her. The decision had come in a cramped hospital room the day she was born. The director had called with an offer to join a major film already halfway through production. I remember the script lying on the bedside table while I traced my finger along her tiny cheek. Fame could wait. A steady paycheck could not. That single choice became the first of hundreds, each one bending my life around hers. Now here I was, decades later, holding a small gift box in my hands, wrapped neatly in paper I had bought from the discount store in town. Inside was my father's gold pocket watch. The chain was worn smooth from years of use, the engraving on the back slightly faded. Time well spent. I had carried it in my pocket through lean years and quiet victories, through double shifts and sleepless nights. Tonight, I meant to give it to her. The night had begun with hope. I had driven from my modest Westbridge duplex in my best clothes-pressed khakis, a navy sweater over a collared shirt. The old truck rattled along the icy road as I made my way to Ethan's neighborhood, where every driveway curved into a grand entrance, and every window glowed with designer warmth. When Lillian opened the door, her eyes lit up the way they always did when she saw me. "Dad, you made it," she said, pressing a quick kiss to my cheek. Her hands brushed the box I carried. "What's that?" "Your grandfather's watch," I told her, keeping my voice steady. "Thought you might want it for the wedding." She smiled, though her gaze darted past me as if to check whether Ethan had seen. Sure enough, he emerged from the living room with a glass of red wine. His handshake was brief and cool, his eyes taking in my outfit like he was assessing a rental property. We sat down for dinner, the kind of meal meant to impress. Seared duck breast, roasted vegetables arranged like art, wine poured into glasses that caught the light from the crystal chandelier overhead. I took the seat Lillian offered, between her and an aunt I barely knew. I tried to make conversation about the wedding, asking how many guests they expected. Ethan's fork moved with surgical precision. "We're keeping it intimate," he said. "Close friends, professional associates, city council members, venture capitalists." Lillian added, "And family, of course." "Of course," Ethan repeated, but there was something in his tone, a reservation, as though the word family was up for debate. The conversation rolled on without me. They discussed the venue, the florist, the menu. Every detail was an opportunity for Ethan to remind the table of the event's exclusivity. I watched Lillian's face, her excitement genuine, and kept my words to myself. When the plates were cleared, Ethan turned to me with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Robert, why don't we step out to the terrace for a moment?" The sliding glass door clicked shut behind us, muting the laughter inside. The cold wrapped around me. Below, workers were stringing lights through the bare branches for the garden ceremony. "This wedding," Ethan began, gesturing toward the view, "is more than a celebration. It's a networking opportunity. People with real influence will be here, senators, CEOs. I need everything to reflect that level. I shifted the watch box in my hands. And what does that have to do with me? You're a waiter, he said plainly. My guests move in different circles. Your presence, it would be problematic. It landed like a blow to the chest. I'm Lillian's father. And she's my fiancée. I won't let sentimentality jeopardize the tone of the event. The garden lights flickered in the distance. My jaw tightened. I paid for her education, 4 years at Berkeley. I worked double shifts so she could graduate debt-free. That's admirable, Ethan replied, as if checking a box. But this is about now. She's my responsibility, and I won't risk my reputation because you want to play proud father in front of my guests. For a long moment, I stared at him. You can't just... I can, and I will. His voice dropped to a whisper. Do you really think you belong in that room? Through the glass door, I saw Lillian pacing, glancing toward us with worry etched on her face. She's my daughter, I said. She's my wife-to-be, he answered, finality in every syllable. Do the right thing. Stay away. I looked down at the watch, its gold surface catching the light from the house. My father's words echoed in my memory. Time well spent. For years, I had believed that was what I'd done. Fine, I said quietly. The word felt like a stone in my throat. Ethan's expression didn't change, but I caught a flicker of satisfaction in his eyes. I'm glad we understand each other. I walked back through the dining room without meeting Lillian's gaze, past the warm smells of roasted duck and spiced wine. At the door, she caught my arm. Dad, wait. It's fine, sweetheart. I kissed her forehead. Congratulations on your engagement. The cold outside bit deeper than before. I climbed into my truck and drove through 3 worlds Ethan's gated neighborhood, the tidy middle-class streets, and finally the cramped blocks where my apartment building stood. No marble foyer, no chandelier, just a dim lobby with old mailboxes and the smell of someone's dinner cooking down the hall. Inside my apartment, the silence pressed in. I set the watch on the kitchen table. The chain lay coiled like a question. I made coffee, the cheap kind that tastes like it was roasted in another century, and sat in the dark. His words replayed in my mind. You're a waiter. Do you really think you belong in that room? A part of me wanted to let it go to avoid the fight, to keep the peace for Lillian's sake. But another part, the one that had stood on film sets and faced cameras without flinching, knew I couldn't. Fine, I had told him. But as I sat there with my father's watch glinting under the lamp, I already knew I wasn't going to stay away. If you want to be there, Robert, there's a way, Victor said, sliding a steaming mug of coffee across the counter. The restaurant was still closed to the public, the front windows clouded slightly from the warmth inside meeting the December chill outside. I had come in early, not for my shift, but because I couldn't stand sitting alone in that apartment replaying Ethan's voice in my head. The bella nota smelled of fresh bread from the kitchen, and the faint tang of garlic lingering from last night's service. The scent was familiar, comforting a place where no one cared about whether I belonged. Victor leaned his elbows on the counter, watching me the way only an old friend could, the kind who knows you well enough to see the storm before you speak it. You look like hell, he said plainly. I wrapped my hands around the mug, letting the heat soak into my fingers. It's about Lillian's wedding, I said. His expression softened. At the Markham place, right? Big money crowd. I nodded, took a sip. He doesn't want me there. Told me I'd embarrass him in front of his guests. Victor's knife paused mid-slice on the cutting board. His shoulders went still, the lines in his face hardening. He said that to you? I explained the terrace conversation, each word making the air between us colder despite the ovens warming the kitchen. "You've given your life for that girl," he said finally, voice low. "You missed opportunities most men would sell their souls for, and this is what you get?" I shrugged, though my chest felt tight. "I just want to see her get married. If that means I have to disappear into the background, so be it." He studied me for a long moment, then said, "Giuseppe still runs that catering company the Markhams hired. We go way back. I'll make a call. Get you on the crew for the night." The idea landed heavy and perfect in my mind. Invisibility had been my armor for years. As a waiter, you moved through rooms like a shadow, hearing everything, seen by no one. "If you can do that?" Victor smiled, though there was no humor in it. "You'd better believe I can. But Robert, it's not right. A father should sit in the front row, not serve drinks to strangers." "Sometimes," I said quietly, "we take what we can get." Later that afternoon, while the staff trickled in for their prep shifts, I kept busy polishing silverware, focusing on the rhythmic motion to keep my thoughts steady. That was when the sound of expensive shoes on tile pulled my eyes to the front entrance. Ethan. He walked in like he owned the place, wearing a tailored overcoat, the kind that made a room seem smaller around the man inside it. Victor's greeting was curt, stripped of his usual warmth. "I'll get right to it," Ethan said, pulling an envelope from his pocket and setting it on the counter. $5,000, all cash. You tell me Robert's not on the crew tomorrow, and it's yours." Victor glanced at the envelope, then at Ethan. "You think I'm for sale?" Ethan's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Everyone has a price." The knife in Victor's hand tapped once against the cutting board before he set it down. "Not me, and not when it comes to a man's daughter's wedding." Ethan's charm flickered, revealing something colder beneath. "You might want to reconsider. I know people at the health department, licensing boards. Little problems have a way of becoming big ones if you're not careful." I stepped out from behind the counter, my voice low. "Enough." He turned toward me, eyes narrowing. "You think working the party will get you anything? You'll still be invisible. No one will know you're there." I let the silence stretch until it became its own answer. He snorted, glanced at Victor one last time, and left without taking the envelope. The door swung shut behind him, but the tension he brought with him hung in the air like smoke. Victor picked up the envelope, walked to the trash, and dropped it in without opening it. "He's scared of you being there," he said. I frowned. "Scared?" "Men like him don't get rattled unless they feel a threat they can't control. You standing in that room even pouring drinks is something he can't spin. He doesn't know what you'll do." We worked in silence for a while, the clatter of pans in the back the only sound. Giuseppe called later, confirming I was on the schedule for the wedding. Uniform required. Black pants, white shirt, black vest, black bow tie. That night, back in my apartment, I laid the uniform out on the bed. I ran my hand over the vest, feeling the seams, the familiar weight. Tomorrow, it would be my ticket inside. Ethan thought he could write me out of Lillian's story. He had no idea I'd been standing in the background of every chapter her whole life. As I turned off the light, Victor's words echoed in my head. "He's scared of you being there." I wondered just how far Ethan would go to keep his perfect picture intact. As I polished the last silver fork that night, I realized Ethan wasn't just trying to keep me away, he was afraid of me being there. "Ladies and gentlemen," Ethan said into the microphone, "success in life comes from understanding your place." The room tightened around the words, as if someone had drawn a cinch around the ballroom's ribs. Crystal chandeliers steadied their glow over polished parquet. White roses trembled in the updraft of a discreetly humming vent, and a low tide of conversations pulled back from the shoreline of laughter to expose careful rocks of silence. Robert Hale stood near a table by the window with a silver tray resting on his palm, the curve of the metal pressing into the heel of his hand in a way he knew he would feel later tonight when he removed his gloves. He had been moving easily for the past hour, pouring champagne with the unself-conscious grace of a man who had learned the physics of crowds the hard way, who could pivot on half a square foot and never clip a shoulder or send a flute chiming to its death. Invisibility was something he wore like another layer of clothing. It kept the heat in and the trouble out. He had promised himself he would not look at his daughter too often, but the promise had been weak. Across the room, Lillian shone in a gown that seemed to catch and hold the tiny stars the lighting designer had sprinkled along the ceiling beams. She had laughed twice out of pure happiness, and once out of nerves, and each time Robert had been far enough away to let the sound travel and fade without crowding her with his pride. When the band muted and the microphone clicked in Ethan's hand, Robert shifted to pour for a trio of guests at a corner table, prepared to keep his eyes down and his fingers steady as the expected phrases moved like polished furniture across the air. Gratitude, love, fortune, partnership. Instead, the man who had barred him from the front row now tested his weight on a different stage. The first minute of the speech wore a familiar shape that put strangers at ease. Ethan thanked those who had flown in, those who had championed his ventures, the city council member who had gone to bat for the last mixed-use development, the mentor whose stern advice had saved him from a youthful mistake. Smiles returned to faces, hands lowered to stemware, and the ballroom relaxed into the posture of being safely entertained. Then a small crease appeared at the corner of Ethan's mouth, the signal to those who truly knew him that he was changing gears. Robert felt the shift before he heard the line. Years ago, he had learned on sets to listen to the slant of a scene, to hear the slight coldness in an actor's breath before a cruel line. He steadied the bottle in his hand and gave the final guest's glass a careful snap of bubbles, then stepped back into the aisle between tables, letting his shoulder brush the cool silk of a floor-length curtain. He kept his body still and his eyes soft. He had survived colder rooms than this, he told himself. He had stood in offices where the numbers of mortgages and tuitions and insurance premiums stacked like cordwood around his chest, and somehow found the breath to say, "Yes, I can take another shift." He would not flinch now. Ethan lifted his gaze to the chandeliers as though drawing courage from their brilliance. He spoke about excellence, about the discipline of winners, about the natural order that made some people creators of wealth and others the beneficiaries of their vision. He did not point yet. He did not need to. His words combed the room in one direction, smoothing the fur of every ego that wished to be stroked in precisely that way. A few guests nodded, a few lifted their chins, others glanced at their partners with a small widening of the eyes that said, "Are we still at a wedding? Or did we stumble into a conference?" At the head table, Lillian held herself carefully, her smile caught between duty and instinct. She looked once toward the back of the room, toward the side entrance where staff came and went, and Robert, who had taught himself to read her face the way other men learned to read balance sheets, saw the question there. "Are you all right?" He was, and he was not. The weight of the tray told him he was present. The steady breath told him he was calm. The prickle under his collar told him he was standing inside the blast radius of a man's pride. He began to move again, one table at a time, topping up flutes that did not need topping. The tiny chime of crystal upon crystal, making a quiet counterpoint to Ethan's voice. At a table near the dance floor, a woman with a pearl comb in her hair leaned toward him and whispered, "Lovely party, is it not?" And he inclined his head and murmured, "It is," and poured until the bubbles reached the same height as her neighbors, the kind of detail people did not consciously see but always felt. From the microphone came the turn. "It is important on nights like this to honor every form of contribution," Ethan said, "and to acknowledge that not everyone reaches the same heights." He smiled. Not everyone matters equally. There it was, set down on the tablecloth like a knife. A few faces froze over. The city council member's wife, who had been a public school teacher for 30 years, blinked twice. The venture capitalist who secretly sent a check to a food pantry every December narrowed his eyes a fraction, then raised his glass to his lips without drinking. And Robert, who had not been meant to be heard everything. "Take this man, for instance," Ethan said. His hand moved like a conductor's baton and stopped precisely at Robert. Hundreds of eyes followed the line of command as effortlessly as sparrows turn on an invisible cue. "Robert Hale." He let the name sit there. "He is just a waiter." The phrase stretched and thinned, a soap bubble in slow motion. Robert shifted his stance to spare his lower back, distributed the tray's weight across his left forearm, and wondered whether the thin young man behind the bar had remembered to chill the second case of brute. It was a strange thing, the way the mind protects itself, the way it searches for a practical foothold when the cliff edge crumbles under the bigger questions of dignity and worth. "He never built anything," Ethan continued, and the microphone did nothing to soften the hard edge of satisfaction in his tone. "He never created jobs or drove innovation or shaped policy. He peaked young, if he ever peaked at all, and now he brings drinks to those who achieved what he could not." A soundless wave passed through the ballroom, the collective intake of breath that civilized people allow themselves when cruelty arrives dressed as candor. Robert felt it move past and through him, as if he were a pillar the tide had learned long ago would not bend. Somewhere in the back, a chair leg creaked. Somewhere at the far table, someone cleared his throat and then regretted the attention it drew. At the head table, Lillian's hand went to her napkin and pressed the linen to her mouth to keep something a sound, a plea, an apology from escaping. Robert could feel the room waiting to see whether the man they had been told was small would scramble to prove he was large, whether he would grasp the microphone and pour his history into it until the circuitry smoked. He let the weight settle over him for 3 beats of his heart, then angled the tray to his right and addressed the nearest table in a voice that belonged to no conflict at all. "Would anyone care for more champagne?" The relief was quiet, but real. A woman in green lifted her flute. A man in a tuxedo with a waistline that admitted defeat held out his glass without looking up. Robert poured for each with exact attention, allowing the perfect, clean ring of crystal to travel outward as if he were setting a new tempo for the night. He moved to the next table and did the same, and the next. Eventually, people began to remember that their hands contained utensils, that their plates contained food, that the band would play again if someone gave them the cue. The first fork touched porcelain, the first laugh, fragile as glass, found its way out of a throat. He reached the perimeter of the dance floor and turned enough to see Ethan still standing, still holding the microphone, but altered. It is a peculiar thing to watch a man lose purchase on an audience he believed he owned. Confidence becomes effort. Effort becomes doubt. The muscles of the jaw work too hard. The eyes flick to the wrong places. Ethan tried to gather the thread. He spoke 2 sentences about gratitude that landed with the soft flop of a fish in a net. He thanked the catering staff, and the thank you sounded like a warning to behave. Then he raised his glass and said, "To excellence," and people said, "To excellence," because there are scripts weddings cannot abandon without consequences. Robert slid past the head table as invisibly as a breeze. He did not look directly at Lillian because he did not trust what his face might show, but he let the circumference of his vision include her. She had composed herself. Her eyes were bright and dry now. the way they became when she had decided to solve a problem rather than cry about it. He felt a twisting pride, the ache of recognition when we see ourselves in the people we love. In the far corner, the bar television with the sound off played black and white images that meant nothing to most of the guests. Background texture chosen by a coordinator who loved the glamour of old movies. A few younger attendees stood near it, their phones open, their thumbs moving, their attention half on the room and half on the curated past looping above the liquor bottles. Robert thought of how film had once been the air he breathed, how the call sheet had been a scripture he rose early to read, how a set was a village in which everyone's work mattered, if any of it mattered. He felt none of the old ache for that life now. What he felt was a steadiness, as if every compromise he had made had stacked into a buttress that held tonight's walls up when someone tried to shake them. By the window again, he shifted his tray to his right hand, and with his left thumb pressed the nerve that ran from wrist to palm, an old trick to keep the fingers loose. Two city officials were exchanging jokes about a budget hearing, as if the lines were difficult, but the audience forgiving. A retired insurance underwriter was telling his wife that the roast was almost as good as their daughter's had been at last Easter. The room had found its equilibrium, but the level would not hold forever, and Robert knew it. He had learned on sets to feel when a scene still had something left to happen. He felt the draft before he heard the new entrance. Not a winter draft from the exterior doors, but the ripple of temperature that follows a change in attention. He turned his head enough to see a small group forming near the bar, the way a pocket of air forms in a river behind a rock. One of the young men, hair too carefully disheveled to be accidental, leaned forward until his face was inches from the screen, his phone forgotten in his lax hand. His mouth opened and stayed open, a child's surprise wearing a grown man's suit. Robert lowered his tray to elbow height. He could not see the television from where he stood, but he did not need to. There are moments in any room when a single person's realization reaches an invisible pitch and begins to tune other people to itself. The pearl-comb woman rose on the balls of her feet. A gentleman with an old-fashioned pocket square turned, squinting in the bar's direction as if distance would not dare blur what he wished to see. Two servers paused mid-step, a breach in choreography that would have gotten them a quiet correction on any other night, and looked where everyone else was looking. Robert's first thought was fiercely practical. If this became a disturbance, he would guide the energy back to the tables. He would take a path along the outer wall to keep the aisle clear. He would exchange a glance with the band leader and get a soft song started. His second thought was a memory of a camera dollying in, of a director's voice, quiet and pleased, saying, "Hold," and "Now." A younger man's face had once filled a movie screen with the kind of hope that made people want to forgive their own failures for 2 hours. That face had been his. He moved one step toward the bar and stopped, choosing his ground the way a carpenter chooses to set a nail on a knot rather than soft grain. He would not push. He would not run to meet whatever this was. He would be what he had been all night, available to serve, immune to insult, steady as a metronome. The tray steadied. His breath steadied. If there was a before and an after to this evening, he would step across the seam without a sound. At the head table, Lillian turned, following the gentle collapse of conversation toward the bar. Her eyes widened, not in fear now, but in unfamiliar wonder, the kind that remakes the shape of a person's face in seconds. Ethan watched her, and then, to see what she saw, he watched the crowd. His hand lowered the microphone until it hung against his thigh like a useless tool. He tried to speak, and did not. In the small failure of sound was a new geometry of the night. Someone near the television lifted a hand, pointing not rudely, but with the unguarded fervor of someone making a connection he needed the world to make with him. The elderly woman with the emerald dress leaned forward, then backward, then forward again, as if calibrating her vision across the decades. A man at the nearest table half rose and then sat because his wife's hand on his sleeve told him that even delight has manners. Robert stood very still. The roses breathed their pale sweetness into the conditioned air. A single champagne bubble, delayed by some minor rebellion in the bottle, rose through his glass and broke against the surface like a late confession. The sound in the room was no longer a hum, but a tuned expectancy. He did not think of the hospital room where he had made the choice that had set the course of his life. He did not think of rent paid late, or engines coaxed through winters, or bank statements whose final numbers had bitten the inside of his cheek. He thought of his daughter at 5 in a paper crown, and at 10 with a skinned knee, and at 17 with a letter from a college whose name sounded like a promise and a bill. He thought of the vow that had glued him together on nights when the glue felt thin. Be there. He was here. The room leaned toward the bar like a field of wheat following the wind. He did not move. The tray did not tilt. He felt something inside him open its hand and release a message to the air. Whatever comes now, let it be true. Then a voice from the back said, "Wait, isn't that the man from that film?" "That's him, the one from Atlantic Crossing!" The words cut through the hush like a match to dry kindling, sparking a fire that spread from table to table in the Harrington House ballroom. For a second, Robert didn't move. He had felt rooms turn before in acting, in life, but never with his name carried on the current. A flicker of the old set lights flashed across his mind, followed by the director's low voice calling, "Action!" That had been another lifetime. He had laid it down without regret. Yet here it was, rising from the background like a song he thought he'd forgotten. The young man at the bar who had spoken was standing now, pointing toward the muted television overhead, his voice bright with recognition. On the screen, a much younger Robert, dressed in a naval officer's uniform, eyes fierce and unyielding, faced another actor in a scene long loved by certain circles. The image was sharp, despite the film's age, the lighting crafted to make his expression the center of gravity. A small crowd began forming around the screen. Phones appeared, fingers swiping, names being typed into search bars. Murmurs swelled. Golden Globe nomination. 7 major films between 1988 and 1995. An elderly woman in an emerald dress rose halfway from her seat, peering over her glasses toward Robert. "I remember that performance," she said, her voice trembling with excitement. "Such presence, such depth." Robert set his tray down on a nearby table and slowly untied his apron, folding it once before placing it beside the champagne bucket. His movements were deliberate, controlled, the kind of physical precision that had once been second nature under the camera's gaze. "Yes," he said finally, his voice carrying over the hush that had fallen. "That was me. I was an actor once." The confession hung in the air, not as a boast, but as a simple truth. "But when my daughter was born, I chose to be her father instead of chasing more roles. I chose steady work, honest work. I have never been ashamed of serving others." Gasps gave way to murmurs of admiration. People leaned in toward each other, repeating his words as if passing a rare coin from palm to palm. Lillian's eyes brimmed with tears, her hands pressed against her mouth as if to keep her heart from tumbling out. She stepped down from the head table and crossed the room, the train of her gown sweeping like a tide behind her. When she reached him, she took his hands in both of hers. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" she asked, her voice trembling. He met her gaze steadily. "Because it didn't matter, not compared to you. The past is just a story. You're my life." Tears rolled down her cheeks. streaking her makeup, but she didn't seem to notice. You gave up everything for me. I gained everything, Robert said softly. A daughter I could raise into a woman I'm proud of. The room had gone entirely still, the kind of stillness that comes when strangers realize they are witnessing something they will remember for the rest of their lives. Even the kitchen staff had stepped out to watch. Then came the first applause from the emerald-dressed woman, and it spread, swelling into a standing ovation. "To Robert Hale!" someone called. "To real fathers!" another voice answered. Robert felt Lillian's arms wrap around him, her veil brushing against his cheek. For a moment, the years of double shifts, late rent, worn shoes, and empty cupboards didn't feel like sacrifices at all. They were investments, and this was the return. At the head table, Ethan Markham remained seated, pale and still, watching as the narrative he had tried to control spun entirely out of his grasp. The man he had called just a waiter was now being toasted by senators, CEOs, and socialites alike. Robert caught his eye briefly, not with triumph, but with the quiet, unshakable dignity that comes from knowing you no longer have anything to prove. Through the crowd came another familiar face. Calvin Pierce, silver-haired and still carrying the easy charisma that had made him a fixture in the industry. "Robert Hale, you magnificent ghost," Calvin said with a grin, pulling him into a quick embrace. "Disappearing at your peak, no wonder they've been talking about you in every documentary pitch meeting for the last 10 years. Robert smiled faintly. "I'm not hiding, Calvin. I'm working. This is my life now." Calvin shook his head. "Your films are still being studied in acting schools. Atlantic Crossing is practically a masterclass. There's talk of a retrospective." "That's flattering," Robert replied. "But I made my choice, and I'd make it again. Success isn't the spotlight, it's the love of the people who matter." Calvin followed his gaze to where Lillian stood, her hand still looped through her father's arm. Understanding softened his features. "She's lucky to have you," he said quietly. Across the room, the murmur of conversation began to shift again. People were watching Ethan now, waiting to see what the groom would do next. Some wore polite curiosity, others barely disguised disapproval. The balance of the evening had tipped, and everyone knew it. Robert excused himself from Calvin's side, moving toward the bar for a cup of coffee. The rich aroma steadied him. He sipped slowly, letting the moment breathe. The night had already given him more than he expected: vindication, pride, a daughter's tears of gratitude. Then, over the soft hum of resumed chatter, came the sound of a microphone being tapped. Robert turned his head just enough to see Ethan standing again, his expression tight, his knuckles pale against the black stem of the mic. From the head table, Ethan scanned the crowd until his eyes found Robert. "I need to say something," he began, his voice lower than before. "To all of you, and to Robert most of all." From the head table, I saw Ethan stand slowly, his face pale and for the first time unsure of his next move. "I was wrong," Ethan said into the microphone, "and I owe this man an apology." The ballroom stilled. A fork clinked softly against a plate somewhere in the back, but otherwise the space felt suspended, as though even the chandeliers were holding their breath. Robert stood near the edge of the dance floor, coffee cup still in his hand, the steam curling upward between them like an invisible barrier. Victor's warning from days before stirred in his mind: men like him don't give up easy. Robert kept his expression neutral, though he could feel every eye in the room shifting from Ethan to himself, measuring the distance between them and wondering how it might be closed. Ethan's voice lacked the glossy certainty it had carried earlier in the evening. "When I first met Robert, I judged him by the wrong measures, by income, by status, by the circles I thought he belonged to. I saw him as someone who didn't fit the image I wanted for tonight." He glanced down, then back up, the hesitation deliberate enough to read as vulnerability. But tonight, I've learned what real character looks like, and I was wrong. Robert studied him. This wasn't the triumph he'd imagined if Ethan ever backed down. This was a man whose carefully curated image was slipping, and who had realized too late that the room's loyalty was shifting towards someone else. "I want to start over," Ethan continued, "not as the father-in-law I tried to hide, but as the man who raised the woman I'm lucky enough to marry." Lillian, still standing near the head table, looked from Ethan to Robert with a raw kind of hope. Her cheeks were flushed from the earlier emotion, but her eyes were bright, willing this moment into something that could heal instead of break. Robert set his coffee aside and walked forward, the muted squeak of polished soles on parquet marking his path. Each step was deliberate, not for drama, but to keep his own temper measured. When he reached Ethan, he extended his hand. The younger man clasped it with both of his, gripping too tightly at first, then easing. "I'm sorry," Ethan said, just loud enough for Robert to hear over the soft rustle of the crowd. "I was threatened by your place in her life. I thought you'd make me look small." "You did that yourself," Robert replied, his voice low but steady. "But we can move forward from here if you mean what you say." They released hands, and Robert turned to Lillian. She crossed the remaining distance between them in 3 quick steps and threw her arms around him, pressing her cheek to his shoulder. "I'm proud to be your daughter," she whispered, and her voice cracked on the words. Around them, the first ripple of applause began hesitant at first, then building as more guests rose to their feet. Glasses were lifted in spontaneous toasts. "To Robert," someone called from the back. Another voice added, "To family." Victor stood at the far edge of the room, a glass of red wine in his hand, his eyes crinkled with satisfaction. He raised the glass in Robert's direction in a subtle salute, the kind only an old friend could give not for the public moment, but for the years behind it. Ethan, perhaps sensing the need to solidify his recovery in the public's eyes, turned back to the microphone. "Tonight was meant to be about celebrating love and new beginnings," he said, "and love means honoring the people who shaped us. Robert Hale taught my wife what true dedication looks like. That's success worth celebrating." The applause swelled again. Robert stood still, letting the sound roll over him without reaching for it. He hadn't come here for approval, but the shift in the air the acknowledgement carried a quiet weight. The band began to tune softly in the corner, the strings plucking out fragments of a melody. The evening was moving forward again, the jagged edges smoothed into something almost harmonious. But Robert could still feel the faint tremor in Ethan's handshake, the unspoken tension that came from a man who had been forced to yield. As the applause faded, Robert caught Victor's eye again. The old friend nodded once, slow and deliberate, a message that needed no words. "You've earned this." From the head table, Lillian turned toward Robert, her expression lighter now, almost playful despite the tears that still glistened. "Would you honor me with the father-daughter dance, Dad?" As the applause faded, I saw Victor raise his glass from the corner, a silent salute to a battle hard won. "Would you honor me with the father-daughter dance, Dad?" The request settled over Robert like warm sunlight after a long storm. For all the applause, the speeches, the handshakes, this was the moment that mattered, the one he had fought for in silence, the one Ethan could never buy or take away. He thought of a morning long ago in their cramped kitchen, Lillian barely 5 years old, standing on his worn leather shoes as he shuffled them in a slow circle to the scratchy sound of an old Sinatra record. Back then, her crown had been folded paper, her gown a pillowcase draped like a cape. Tonight the crown was a delicate silver comb, and the gown shimmered with every turn of her head. The ballroom's lighting had softened for the dance, the white garlands strung along the walls casting a warm glow that smoothed the edges of the evening's earlier tension. Guests began to form a wide circle around the polished parquet dance floor, their voices quieting in anticipation. The scent of roses still lingered from the centerpieces, mingling with the faint notes of champagne and wood polish. Robert took Lillian's hand. It was small, but strong, the hand of a woman who had made her own way in the world, but had not forgotten where she came from. As the band struck the first notes, a slow, timeless melody, they stepped together into the open space. For a moment, it was only the two of them, her eyes bright with unshed tears, his with a quiet pride that no one could mistake for anything but love. Around them, conversations hushed. The senators, the CEOs, the polished wives and husbands of Ethan's circle, all of them watched without the filter of status now. They saw a father and daughter turning slowly, each step an unspoken chapter in a shared history. Robert's mind drifted through those chapters. The night shifts, the school plays, the college acceptance letter he had read 3 times before calling her, the way she had hugged him so hard after graduation that his back ached for hours. Ethan stood just outside the circle, his hands clasped in front of him, his expression unreadable. He had the look of a man who understood that whatever else happened tonight, this dance was beyond his reach, a territory marked by years he could never inhabit. Halfway through the song, Lillian leaned in and whispered, "Thank you for not letting him keep you away." Robert smiled faintly. "Thank you for wanting me here." As they turned, Robert caught Victor's gaze over Lillian's shoulder. The restaurateur gave a small nod of approval, the same look he might give a chef whose dish had turned out perfectly under pressure. Nearby, Calvin Pierce lifted his glass in a salute, his expression both proud and wistful, as if remembering the young actor who had once commanded a set. The song wound toward its final bars. Robert's grip on Lillian's hand tightened slightly, memorizing the feel of it, the warmth, the weight. When the last note lingered and faded, the applause that followed was different from before, less performative, more genuine. People weren't clapping for a celebrity rediscovered or a public reconciliation. They were clapping for a father and daughter whose bond had been tested and had endured. Lillian squeezed his hand one last time before stepping back, her eyes still locked on his. "I love you, Dad." "I love you too," he said, the words plain and steady, carrying more truth than anything else spoken that night. Guests began to drift back toward the buffet tables and the bar, the spell of the moment giving way to the comfortable hum of a reception in full swing. The band shifted to an upbeat number, couples taking to the floor. Lillian returned to Ethan's side, and though Robert noticed the groom reach for her hand, it was Lillian who initiated the gesture. Robert lingered at the edge of the dance floor, letting the warmth of the moment settle into his bones. He had not come here to win over this crowd, but somehow, in the quiet defiance of simply being present, he had done just that. Near the back, Victor approached, slipping his hands into his pockets. "Looks like you got what you came for," he said. Robert nodded. And more. From the corner of his eye, he saw Calvin make his way toward him again, a half smile on his face. "If you ever change your mind about coming back," Calvin said, "you know where to find me." Robert chuckled. "I think I'm right where I'm supposed to be." The band began another slow song, couples spinning and swaying under the glow of the chandeliers. Robert turned slightly toward the bar, where a fresh pot of coffee was being set out for guests who preferred warmth over wine. His hands itched for a cup, something steady and familiar to close the night. As he moved toward it, he glanced back once more at Lillian. She was laughing now, her face lit with something easy and unguarded, the earlier strain replaced by genuine joy. That, he thought, was the victory, not the applause, not the vindication, but this look on her face. As the final song played, I realized the battle was over, and I'd won without ever raising my voice. There is a kind of peace that comes only after you have walked through the fire and refused to let it consume you. Robert's journey was never about reclaiming a title or demanding the approval of people who had once turned their backs on him. It was about reclaiming himself. In the quiet moments after the dance with Lillian, he understood that the true reward was not in proving Ethan wrong or silencing the whispers of the crowd. The reward was in knowing that he had stood his ground without losing the kindness or dignity that had defined him his whole life. For years, he had lived with the slow erosion of respect, allowing others to speak over him, dismiss him, and paint their own version of his story. He had endured holidays where his absence was treated as convenient, conversations where his sacrifices were rewritten or forgotten entirely. But the man who walked into that ballroom was not the same man who had once been pushed aside. He carried with him the quiet strength of someone who had measured his worth long before anyone else tried to assign a value to it. Respect is not something you beg for. It is something you command by living in alignment with your values. That night, Robert didn't have to demand it. The way he carried himself, the way he danced with Lillian, the way he greeted even those who had once looked down on him, all of it spoke louder than any speech could. The applause was not the validation. It was merely the echo of the truth that had been there all along. Family is more than blood or shared history. It is the willingness to show up for one another even when it is difficult. Robert had shown up, not because it was easy, but because it mattered. He knew that if he let Ethan's arrogance dictate the terms of his relationship with Lillian, he would be surrendering far more than an evening. He would be teaching her that love can be controlled, that respect can be withheld as punishment. Instead, he taught her, without ever saying the words, that boundaries are not walls, but lines drawn to protect what is sacred. The arrogance of others often comes from their own insecurities. Ethan's need to diminish Robert in front of others was not a reflection of Robert's worth, but of Ethan's fear that he could never truly measure up in Lillian's eyes. And when the truth finally settled in, Ethan had to stand there and watch as Lillian chose to honor her father. That moment was its own kind of justice, quiet, unflinching, and undeniable. Robert's revenge was never about grand gestures or public humiliation. It was about reclaiming the space that was always his. It was about walking into that room on his own terms, standing tall in the face of every sidelong glance, and leaving with the respect he had been denied for far too long. The beauty of his victory was that it was rooted in grace, not spite. He didn't have to raise his voice, call out names, or make accusations. His presence was enough. There is a lesson in that for anyone who has ever been underestimated or pushed aside. You do not have to fight in the way your detractors expect. Sometimes the most powerful form of resistance is to simply refuse to shrink, to continue living in a way that honors your own worth, even when others cannot see it. For Robert, the evening was not just a wedding reception. It was a line in the sand. It was the moment he chose to stop letting other people define his role in his own family. And once he crossed that line, there was no going back. The people who truly mattered, Lillian, Victor, Calvin, saw him for who he was and respected him for it. The rest no longer had the power to wound him. Even as the music faded and the guests began to leave, Robert knew the impact of that night would linger. It would shape the way Lillian approached her own life, the way she demanded respect in her own relationships. It would stand as a reminder to Ethan and anyone like him that arrogance has a cost, and that cost is often the very respect they crave. In the days and years to come, Robert would carry the memory of that dance as a quiet reassurance. Whenever doubt tried to creep in, he would remember the look in Lillian's eyes, the strength in her voice when she asked him to dance, the way the room seemed to fall away until it was just the two of them. That was the truth of their bond, untouchable, unshakable, and earned over a lifetime. For those listening to his story, the takeaway is simple but profound. Never let anyone make you feel small in spaces you have a right to occupy. Stand firm in your truth, even when it is uncomfortable. Protect your dignity as fiercely as you would protect someone you love. Because in the end, the way you carry yourself will outlast the judgments of others. Robert's philosophy remains: self-respect is the foundation on which every meaningful relationship must be built. Without it, love becomes fragile, respect becomes conditional, and peace becomes impossible. With it, you can face any room, any person, any challenge, and know you are enough. If you felt the weight of Robert's journey, if you believe in standing your ground and protecting your dignity, then leave a comment with the words "Number 1" below. And do not forget to subscribe to our channel so you can hear the next story, one that may just remind you of your own quiet victories.